Imagine this. It's 1974. A Filipino farmer walks through the thick jungle of Lubang Island when he hears rustling in the trees. He expects an animal, maybe a boar, maybe a monkey. Instead, a man in a tattered Japanese uniform steps out of the shadows holding an old rifle. His face is thin, his eyes sharp. He shouts in Japanese, "Who goes there?" The war, for him, is not over. That man was Lieutenant Hiru Onoda, and the year was almost 3 decades after World War II had ended. He wasn't insane. He wasn't delusional. He was doing exactly what he had been ordered to do. Never surrender. Never die. Continue the mission. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the world celebrated peace. Cities began to rebuild. Nations began to breathe again. But for a handful of Japanese soldiers scattered across the Pacific, the message never reached them. Or worse, they refused to believe it. In their minds, the emperor still fought, and Japan would rise again. They hid in jungles, mountains, and caves. They stole food, avoided villagers, and carried on guerrilla warfare for years. To them, every plane in the sky was an American scout. Every voice in the jungle was an enemy spy. Even when leaflets were dropped announcing Japan's surrender, they thought it was Allied propaganda, a psychological trick to lure them out. And so they stayed hidden. For years. For decades. Some died of disease, some vanished forever. But a very few, survived long enough to see a world that had completely moved on without them. If you've never heard about these men before, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. We uncover the forgotten stories of those who lived through the impossible. And this one might be the most unbelievable of them all. Hiru Onoda wasn't the only one. On islands like Guam, Saipan, and Mindoro, soldiers were discovered living in isolation long after Japan's defeat. In 1951, 2 men were found still fighting on Mindoro Island. In 1955, another surrendered in the Marianas. And in 1960, 15 years after the war, one soldier finally walked out of the jungle barefoot, holding a rusted rifle and bowing in apology. For them, surrender wasn't an option. They had been raised in a Japan where honor meant everything. To die for the emperor was the highest duty. To surrender was the ultimate shame. It wasn't just loyalty, it was identity. That's why they stayed hidden, starving, sick, and alone, because dying in the jungle was better than living in dishonor. They called them holdouts, soldiers who refused to believe the war had ended. But that word doesn't do justice to what they endured. They weren't just soldiers. They were ghosts, trapped between the past and the present, loyal to a nation that no longer existed. And for Hiru Onoda, this was not madness. This was duty, his mission, his belief, his life, frozen in time. He would fight the same war, in the same jungle, for 29 years after it ended. And the story of how he finally surrendered is one of the most haunting and human stories in history. By mid-April 1945, the thunder at the horizon had become a constant roar. The Soviet guns were no longer miles away. They were at the gates. Every explosion shook the ground like an earthquake. The walls of Berlin trembled, windows fell, and dust filled the air like fog. The people knew. The city was surrounded. There would be no escape. Marshal Zhukov's first Belarusian front was advancing from the east. Konev's first Ukrainian front closed in from the south. In the north, Rokossovsky's troops cut off the last rail lines. The Red Army was everywhere. Tanks, artillery, endless columns of men moving through fields of wreckage. By April 21st, Soviet shells were falling in the city center. The sound was deafening, endless, like a storm that would never stop. Inside the city, the German command tried to hold order, but there was no order left. Maps were useless, streets no longer existed, communication lines were cut. Whole units vanished without a trace. A German officer wrote in his diary, "We fight for streets that no longer exist. We die for walls that have already fallen." For 12 years, Berlin had been the symbol of power. Torchlight parades, banners, speeches. Now it was the front line. Every street became a fortress. Every apartment, a bunker. Every intersection, a killing ground. Teenagers of the Hitler Youth crouched behind barricades with Panzerfausts, their faces pale and dirty. Women carried ammunition in baskets once used for bread. The Volkssturm, old men and boys, fought with rifles older than themselves. They weren't soldiers. They were ghosts trying to stop an ocean. A Soviet tank commander later said, "We met no army. We met desperation." Soviet artillery turned the city into fire. Buildings collapsed like sandcastles. Smoke covered the sky so completely that day and night became the same gray blur. From the rooftops, you could see the Spree River reflecting flames. From the streets, you could only see shadows running through smoke. Every step forward cost dozens of lives. The Soviets advanced meter by meter, block by block. Snipers fired from church towers, machine guns echoed from underground tunnels. A Red Army soldier wrote, "The city was alive, but it screamed." Civilians were trapped between two worlds, the collapsing Reich and the advancing Red Army. Some hid in basements, praying the shells would pass them by. Others ran into the open, waving white cloths, hoping someone would see they weren't soldiers. In some neighborhoods, people hung sheets from windows, silent cries for mercy. But the battle didn't stop for anyone. "We no longer knew who was enemy or friend," a Berlin woman said. "There was only noise, dust, and death." By April 25th, Soviet forces had completely surrounded Berlin. The trap was closed. Inside were nearly 2 million people, soldiers, civilians, and those who still believed the end could somehow be avoided. No food, no fuel, no reinforcements. Only the ruins of what once was a city. The Reich was now reduced to a few dozen streets, a handful of fanatics, and a man in a bunker still promising victory that would never come. And outside, the Red Army was waiting, not for orders, but for dawn. While Berlin burned above, deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, the lights were still on. The air smelled of smoke and sweat and fear. Concrete walls dripped with condensation, and the low hum of generators filled the silence between explosions. This was the Führerbunker, the final refuge of a dying empire. Behind thick steel doors, Hitler and his closest followers lived in a world cut off from reality. Maps hung on the walls, marked with red and blue arrows, lines that no longer existed outside. They spoke of divisions that were gone, generals who were dead, victories that had never happened. It was a kingdom of ghosts, commanded by a man who refused to see them. Hitler still gave orders as if the war could be turned around. He screamed at his generals, demanded counterattacks, and moved imaginary troops across the map. He refused to believe that the Red Army was already in the streets above him. "Where is Wenck? He will rescue us," he shouted. "The 12th Army is on its way." But there was no Wenck, no army, no rescue. Every day his world grew smaller, the corridors, the lies, the hope. Around him, life went on, in a way that didn't feel like life at all. Secretaries typed reports no one would read. Guards polished boots that would never march again. Eva Braun smiled at dinners lit by flickering candles, pretending the bombs above were distant thunder. They toasted to victory with cheap champagne, while outside children starved in the ruins. One officer later said, "It was like a theater after the audience had left, actors still speaking their lines to an empty hall." Even underground, the fear was suffocating. Everyone knew the end was coming, but no one wanted to be the first to admit it. Every day brought new news, and every piece of it worse than the last. Goebbels' voice echoed through the hallways, promising that Berlin would hold, that the Führer would never abandon his people. But even his eyes had gone empty. Outside the bunker, people whispered that Hitler was gone already, either dead or fled. Inside, he paced from room to room, his hands trembling, his words breaking apart. "Betrayal everywhere," he muttered. "They have all failed me." He no longer spoke of the German people, only of himself. By the end of April, reality could no longer be denied. The Russians were 2 blocks away. The artillery was so close that the bunker shook with every shot. Even the lights flickered. Officers begged him to let the civilians surrender, to save what was left of the city. He refused. "I will not leave Berlin," he said. "Better to fall here than live in defeat." He ordered the remaining soldiers to fight to the last bullet. Some obeyed, most didn't. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun disappeared into a small room at the end of the corridor. A few minutes later, there was a single gunshot. No one cried. No one spoke. The man who promised a 1,000-year Reich was gone, leaving only ashes behind. Above them, the Red Army advanced through the smoke, unaware that history had just changed, and that the world they were fighting was already dead. Above the bunker, the city was burning. The sky glowed red every night, and the air was thick with ash and smoke. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the stench of fire and decay. Streets that once carried parades now carried the dead. The thunder of artillery never stopped. The ground shook, the walls cracked, and yet people still fought. The Red Army had reached the center of Berlin. Tanks moved slowly through narrow streets filled with rubble and wrecked trams. Snipers fired from church towers. Grenades exploded in stairwells. Every building was a battlefield, every basement a grave. The German defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, and starving. But many refused to surrender. Boys from the Hitler Youth, barely 15, ran through the smoke with Panzerfausts, shouting, "Für Führer und Vaterland," before disappearing in the blast. A Soviet soldier wrote, "They were just children. We didn't want to shoot, but they shot first." Fighting raged around the Reichstag, the heart of what was left of the Reich. It wasn't strategy anymore. It was survival. Machine guns rattled from windows. Artillery shells tore buildings apart. And soldiers fought hand to hand in corridors filled with fire and dust. Zhukov's men advanced building by building, room by room, flag by flag. The order was clear: take Berlin, whatever the cost. And the cost was enormous. The Red Army lost thousands in those last few days alone. For them, victory was just a few hundred meters away. But those meters felt endless. "We could see the Reichstag," one soldier said, "but between us and it was hell." In the ruins, civilians hid wherever they could: cellars, subway tunnels, under collapsed bridges. They were starving, terrified, and trapped. For many, the world had already ended. A woman recalled, "The shells came so close that the air turned solid. The walls shook, and the lamps went out. We sat in the dark and waited for the roof to fall. Some tried to flee, carrying white flags, but there was nowhere to go. The city was surrounded, the exits gone, and the sound of battle came from every direction. For most, surrender wasn't a choice. It was a prayer. Soviet soldiers moved like ghosts through the ruins, exhausted, covered in dust, eyes hollow from weeks of fighting. They had come all the way from Stalingrad, Kursk, and the frozen fields of the east. They had lost too many to count. Now they were here, at the gates of the enemy's capital. But victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like the end of something too big to understand. One officer later said, "We fought for revenge, but when we got it, we only felt tired." On April 30th, as Hitler's body cooled in the bunker below, Soviet troops stormed the Reichstag. They climbed through windows, fought across marble staircases, and planted red flags on every floor. By nightfall, the building was a skeleton of fire and stone. At dawn, a flag waved from the rooftop, the red banner over Berlin. Soldiers stood in silence, staring at it. No cheering, no celebration, only the sound of wind moving through smoke. They had won, but the city around them was dead. It was 1974, 29 years after Japan's surrender. A young Japanese man named Norio Suzuki, only 24 years old, stepped off a small boat onto Lubang Island in the Philippines. He wasn't a soldier, not a government agent, just an adventurer with a backpack, a camera, and a dream. When reporters later asked him what he was looking for, he smiled and said, "I want to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order." People laughed. But he wasn't joking. He had read stories of the ghost soldier still fighting in the jungle, and he decided to find him, alone. Suzuki wandered the dense forests, calling out in Japanese, "Onoda-san, the war is over. Japan has changed. Please come home." Days passed. The jungle was silent except for insects and the rain. Then, one morning, as he crossed a small stream, a shadow moved in the trees. A man stepped out, thin, armed, cautious. His uniform was ragged, his rifle rusted but ready. Hiru Onoda aimed at him and demanded, "Who are you?" Suzuki didn't raise his hands. He smiled gently, bowed deeply, and said, "I am Japanese too. I came from your country. The war ended a long time ago." Onoda hesitated. No one had spoken to him like that in decades. Suzuki took out a photo of himself with his family. Modern clothes, bright smiles, a world Onoda didn't recognize. The two men stared at each other across 30 years of history. One from a world that had never stopped fighting, the other from a world that had already forgotten the war. They talked for hours. Suzuki told him about Japan, about skyscrapers, cars, televisions, baseball. He told him the emperor was alive, but Japan was now a peaceful nation. Onoda listened quietly, his face unreadable. Finally, he said, "If the emperor has truly ended the war, then my superior officer must give me the order to stop. Until then, I will continue." It wasn't defiance. It was faith. Onoda wasn't waiting for Japan. He was waiting for permission to live. Suzuki nodded. He promised to return with Onoda's commanding officer, Major Taniguchi. And then, in one of the strangest goodbyes in history, they shook hands. One man disappeared back into the jungle. The other went home to find a ghost's final order. When Suzuki returned to Japan, newspapers exploded with the story. Lieutenant Onoda found alive after 29 years in hiding. It was unbelievable. The government tracked down Taniguchi, now a quiet bookseller in Japan, and asked him to travel to Lubang Island. He agreed. A month later, he arrived, older, grayer, carrying the uniform and sword of the old imperial army. He walked into the jungle calling, "Onoda, it's me. I order you to cease operations." For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the trees, a voice answered, "Yes, sir." When Onoda finally emerged, he was dressed in full uniform, rifle in hand, sword at his side, everything perfectly maintained. He saluted his superior officer one last time and wept. The mission was over. After 29 years of war, Hiroo Onoda surrendered, not to an enemy, but to peace. When Hiroo Onoda finally stepped out of the jungle in March 1974, cameras flashed like lightning, reporters shouted, soldiers saluted, and crowds cheered. He stood there, thin, sunburned, his rifle in his hands, as if he had just walked out of another century. His uniform was worn but immaculate, his rifle still functional. Even his sword gleamed, wrapped carefully in oil and cloth. He saluted the flag of Japan as if 29 years had never passed. For a moment, the world was silent. A man who had refused to believe the war had ended was now proof of how deeply belief could shape reality. When he arrived in Tokyo, people lined the streets. The government treated him as both a hero and a relic, a man from a vanished empire. He met the emperor, who thanked him for his service. And Onoda, bowing deeply, said quietly, "It is an honor to finally return my sword to your majesty." But as he looked around, he didn't recognize his country anymore. Japan had changed. The cities were alive with neon lights and advertisements. The streets were filled with laughter, cars, and Western music. No one talked about the war anymore, only about the future. To him, it felt like another world. The honor, the sacrifice, the faith that had guided his life. Gone. People now cared about money, comfort, television shows. For the first time, Onoda felt lost. When reporters asked him how he survived so long, he said, "I was trained to never give up. I stayed alive because I had orders. Without orders, I had nothing." That line cut deep. For nearly 30 years, duty had been his purpose, his reason to wake up, to breathe, to fight. Now that duty was gone. He was free. But freedom felt like emptiness. He visited the families of his fallen comrades. He wept as he spoke their names. He said he had carried their spirits through the jungle for decades. And now, at last, he could let them rest. But peace, for him, was harder than war. A year later, Onoda left Japan for Brazil. He said the new Japan made him feel like a stranger, too fast, too soft, too forgetful. He bought land, raised cattle, and tried to live quietly. But the jungle never left him. Every sound, every shadow reminded him of the world he had left behind. In his memoirs, he wrote, "The jungle was more real than civilization. In the jungle, I knew who I was." He returned to the Philippines once more in 1996 to apologize for the raids and the lives lost. He bowed deeply before the people of Lubang, tears in his eyes. They forgave him. Some even thanked him for his sincerity. It was the moment he had truly come home, not to Japan, but to peace. When Hiroo Onoda died in 2014, he was 91 years old. He had lived more than half his life in a world that no longer existed. But in a way, he had outlived history itself, because his story wasn't just about war. It was about faith, loyalty, and what happens when a man builds his entire life around an idea and then survives it. Hiroo Onoda's story didn't end with his death. It began to live again in classrooms, books, and documentaries. People saw him not just as a soldier, but as a mirror, a mirror reflecting how far humanity can go when belief replaces truth. To some, he was a hero, the last samurai, a man of honor who never broke his code. To others, he was a tragedy, a man trapped by the ghosts of his own loyalty. But maybe he was both. When his story reached the world, it became a question more than a tale. What does it mean to be loyal? And when does loyalty become blindness? How far can a person go in the name of duty before that duty destroys them? And how do you return to a world that forgot you existed? Those questions still haunt people today, because every generation fights its own invisible war, maybe not with guns and uniforms, but with beliefs, pride, and the fear of being wrong. And sometimes, we all build jungles of our own making, places we hide in because the truth outside feels too hard to face. For nearly 30 years, Onoda had no one to tell him he was free. He lived, fought, and bled for a world that ended while he wasn't looking. And when he finally came home, he realized that even though the war was over, the struggle to find meaning had just begun. His story reminds us of something rare in today's world: conviction. Even if it was misplaced, even if it caused pain, it was real. He believed in something greater than himself. And in a time when everything changes every second, that's something almost no one remembers how to do. When people asked him if he regretted the decades he lost, he said simply, "No, I did what I was trained to do. I stayed faithful to my orders." But maybe the real lesson isn't about faith. It's about learning when to let go, about understanding that even the strongest loyalty must have an end. That peace isn't just the silence after war, it's the courage to stop fighting when the battle's already over. And maybe that's what makes Onoda's story timeless, because in a world full of noise, he reminds us of the danger of believing so deeply that we forget to see the truth. And yet, he also reminds us of something beautiful: that purpose, even when misplaced, can keep a person alive against all odds. So if you've made it this far, you've just walked through 3 decades of one man's faith and the jungle that never let him go. And if stories like this make you stop for a second, think, and feel something, then hit that subscribe button and like the video. Because the past still has voices, and together, we're here to make sure they're never forgotten.